am honored to be able to introduce Dr. James Comer and Miss Katie Haycock, both of which have won in previous years the James Bryant Conan Award. I will do my best to highlight their credentials, but what I'm going to say doesn't even come close to what they've achieved on behalf of education so far. Dr. Comer is the founder of the Comer School of Development, which promotes the collaboration of parents, educators, and communities to improve social, emotional, and academic outcomes for children. Their purpose is to help them achieve greater school success. His concept of teamwork has improved the educational environment in more than 500 schools across our country. Dr. Comer has concentrated his career on promoting a focus on child development as a way of improving schools, and his efforts to support healthy development of young people are known internationally. In 2014, Dr. Comer was appointed by President Obama to the President's Advisory Commission on Educational Excellence for African Americans. And in addition to his writings, teachings, and research activities, Dr. Comer has served as a consultant to the Children's Television Workshop, which produces Sesame Street and The Electric Company. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Comer to the stage. Yeah, either one of those works great. I'm also very excited to be able to introduce Miss Katie Haycock. Katie's leadership has been tremendous with the Education Trust, where she serves as president. Established in 1996, the Trust works for the high academic achievement of all students at all levels, from pre-kindergarten all the way through college. With Katie's leadership, they work to close gaps in both opportunity and achievement that consign too many low-income students and students of color to lives on the margin of America's mainstream. Known for years as a powerful force in education policy, the Trust is often described as the most important truth teller in American public education. Katie's impressive background in education includes serving as Executive Vice President of the Children's Defense Fund and President of the Achievement Council. She has received numerous national awards for her service on behalf of our nation's youth and serves as a director on several education-related boards, including the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, the New Teacher Project, and the Hunt Institute. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Katie Haycock to the stage. Well, we're excited to have both of you here with us and really to kind of look at the big picture of where you see things. We all have only about 23 people who've been awarded the James Bryant Conan Award, and both of you have received it for your work in previous research and previous activities you've done. So we're excited to have you here to share with us some of those insights. Katie, it might be best kind of talking to you first and kind of thinking about what are some of the bright spots out there that you see? Opportunities where there's policies that you think are trying to make a difference and are seeing some outcomes that are meaningful.
Thanks for asking. You know, one of the saddest things that I find about the last year or two is that the kind of dominant narrative in education is that our schools aren't getting better, that we're not making progress. But the reality is the data tell a very different story. What I want to do is just show you a little bit of what the good news is in American education. What you're looking at up on the screen shows fourth grade reading achievement by group for the country as a whole. And as you can see, in the last 12 years, what we're seeing is sharp improvements for all groups of kids, especially fast improvements for children of color. This is also true for low-income kids. And the smallest gap between groups that we've ever seen in this country's history. So very good news in fourth grade reading. There's good news too, as you can see here in fourth grade math, where again, sharp improvements for all groups of kids, record performance for all groups of kids, and also the smallest gaps between groups we've ever had. Now you shift over and look at the data a little bit differently, and you can begin to understand what this means for individual kids. What you're seeing up in this screen shows fourth grade math performance back in 1996. And just a quick clue to what you're seeing, wherever you see red, those are the kids about whom we need to worry a lot. They were performing at the below basic level, means they're not even close to having the skills we know they need in the years ahead. Green kids, by contrast, are doing just fine. They're proficient or advanced. Yellow, someplace in between. So let's look just at African American kids for a moment. Back in 1996, roughly 3/4 of African American kids trapped at the below basic level, only 3% proficient or advanced. Let's fast forward to today. As you can see, the numbers at that dangerous red category more than reduced by half. Meanwhile, 6 times as many at the highest achievement levels. And you see the same difference with Latinos as well. When you move up to the middle grades, the pattern's much the same, although the improvements are not quite as pronounced. That's a look at 8th grade reading over time. This is a look at 8th grade math, where again, we're seeing improvements for all groups of kids, record performance for all groups of kids, and the smallest gaps between groups we've ever had. And let's be clear here, that's national progress. When you dig underneath that, what you see is far faster progress in a set of states that are really leading the pack in improvement. If you look at growth for African American kids, for example, Pennsylvania, Florida in particular made more than twice as much growth as the country as a whole did for African American kids in the past decade. You see the numbers here for Latino youngsters, with Maryland and Florida leading the pack there, with again more than twice as much growth in the country as a whole for Latinos. Look at gains for low-income students, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Hawaii leading the pack, once again with almost twice the progress for low-income kids as we've seen in the country as a whole. And let's be clear here, it's not just individual states that are teaching us that we can get this job done, but some districts as well. If you look, for example, at the progress for poor African American kids in 4th grade math, Los Angeles, San Diego, and the District of Columbia made literally twice as much progress as did the country as a whole. And just to understand those numbers, that's like 20 points of growth is about 2 grade levels worth of learning. What that says to you is that 4th grade African American kids from low-income families in these 3 cities are performing roughly where 6th grade African American kids were just 10 years ago. You see that same progress, as you can see here, for Latinos, with Boston, DC, and Chicago leading the pack, and the progress in 8th grade math here for African American kids, with Los Angeles and Atlanta leading the pack. My point here isn't that we've gotten the job done yet, but my point here is that in every one of your states, there are districts and schools that are teaching us what we can do. Every one of us can learn from those places and ought to be doing that, and every one of our states can also be learning from other states that are teaching us that we can get the job done when we really focus.
Those are impressive numbers, and I think it's an important thing for us to remember as policymakers. There are successes out there.
Yeah.
The job is not finished, but there's still a lot that we can work on. Dr. Comer, when you received the James Bryant Conant Award, there was a lot of your research that was focused on more than just what happens within the school. How do the children come prepared to learn, and what are the environments that help to make that happen? Can you talk a little bit more about some of your work and how that led to you winning the award?
Thank you. I am pleased by the advances that are taking place in the academic area. But when we, in 1991, I believe I won the award, it was 2 years, I think, after I had written the book about my family, mostly about my mother, called Maggie's American Dream. And I think what I pointed out in that book is that my parents, who were low-income people, mother had less than 2 years of education, my father less than 6, worked as steel mill laborer, domestic, and the 2 of them provided the 5 of us with an experience that allowed the 5 of us to gain 13 college degrees.
Impressive.
And it was that experience, while realizing that my friends, who were just as smart, were going on a downhill course. And so that led me to, on a path to become do work in public health, psychiatry, child psychiatry, and eventually in schools, with the question, what happened to them? that was different from what happened to me. And I realized that it was the quality of the developmental experience that I received at home that they did not receive. And that led me to ask, well, what can be done about it? And to begin to focus on schools as the place where you can make a difference for children who have not had that experience if you create the culture, the environment in school that allows the adults to work together in a way that they can support development of children that will make it possible for them to learn at a high level, but also to be able to perform after school and in their lives and as citizens. That's what we have focused on over the years. And so the question I've had, and I wished many times that I could have an opportunity to speak to the key policymakers from all the states, and here I am. The one thing I would like to say is that we have to focus on the centrality of development, and we have to figure out a way to organize all the things we do and all the people around us so that they are focused on development and asking the question is, how do we organize and manage all of our institutions so that they empower schools to enable children to do well and develop well and do well, and that that's possible. But we can't leave it as in the last session with Pedro and others, we made the point that you can't leave it to schools alone, that it has to be the entire society organizing in a way to make that difference. And that essentially is what we're doing, trying to do in New Haven right now. But the policies must be changed in order to make that possible.
Absolutely. Some of the policy issues are interesting, and Katie, I'd love to get some of your thoughts on, what's really trending with some of the policies. The federal government, Congress maybe in particular, does not seem like it's primed to take action on some of the education policies soon. This is the very reason that the Education Commission of the States was founded 50 years ago, with questions about the first Elementary and Secondary Education Act. What are some of the policies that states need to be considering, or at least taking a lead in, which maybe they haven't always done, if they're going to see successes?
So I'm actually, I think, a bit more bullish on this Congress finally getting reauthorization done. It was actually just a wonderful session just before this one with some folks from the Hill and others. And I think those of us who are working on reauthorization are not confident, perhaps, that it's going to get done, but I'd give it personally a 75% chance. But I think those of you who've been following it know that Congress is inclined to leave much more of the decision-making for the next 7 or 10 or 30 years in your court. So there will be a set of questions that states will need to struggle with, including ones raised by both Jim and Pedro this morning about sort of as we move beyond simply tests as a kind of be-all and end-all indicator around school performance, what are the other set of indicators that we ought to be including in getting sort of a fuller measure, both of whether students are adequately prepared, not just academically, but in every other way for what will face them after high school, but also what are the ways in which we want to look at schools' effectiveness in doing that job. So I think one of the biggest questions for state-level policymakers will be how to keep the focus on the sort of core outcomes of schooling while also including sort of broader measures there. And it's very easy when you move to a multiple measure system to obscure the most important outcomes of schooling. So that's going to be, I think, the tricky dance that states will have to be doing.
Dr. Comer, a lot of your research has talked about the necessary additional services, what happens before school and after school, and how do you build kind of a full opportunity for these students. Talk about where you're seeing difficulties for states due to budget constraints or policies that go beyond what a traditional K-12 definition is in many laws.
Well, you just listed the problems, the major problems, but it's still possible to make a difference. And I think one of the things that we need to do is to look at how we find communities that are making progress and develop some place-based programs or projects where we bring all of the partners together who need to be involved. And we, in New Haven, we're trying to do that. We have a mayor, first African-American, first woman, who really understands the problems of children, the problems of marginalized people, and she has mobilized all of the departments in a way that if we can get the state government, federal government to really support this, we can begin to understand where the problems are and where we can make a difference at the practice level. Now, it's one thing to have a policy up top, and it's another thing to carry it out at the ground level. And that's what we're trying to do and what I think needs to happen, to bring private sector together with public, to bring all of the partners together in ways that it can be coordinated and where we can identify problems on the spot. I remember this last summer where they started out describing a child who was at risk and was going to have trouble and had trouble. We interviewed that young person, and everybody thought then about what we could do. Well, everybody brought a academic achievement improvement approach the first round. But then they talked with kids, and they decided that it had to be a community development approach, a support for good relationships that would make the difference. It was only because it was on the ground and sharing with the kids that we were able to turn people around and begin to identify what would really make a difference. And I think that's an approach we should examine.
If I could just build on that a little bit, though, one of the things that I know you worry about, though, Jim, is how people should not interpret what you just said. One of the things that happens as folks sort of broaden how they think about educating kids and broaden the participants, especially when you pull in social and human services, it is easy to assume that if you fix all that, you don't have to worry about what goes on in the classroom. And I know you don't mean that, but I think it's really important in this environment in particular to remind people that matters too. My daughter's a psychologist and had a very interesting experience for the last 5 years working in a school in DC for court-involved kids. She led a mental health team of PhD and MSW folks, a team of 7 for 190 kids. So it was an amazing investment in family and child supports. But as she told me every evening, but Mom, they're not teaching the kids. The first year there, 15 out of 17 teachers were brand new, first year TFA. If you don't think that's a train wreck, it is a serious train wreck. That year was the last year any white people ever worked in that school except for my kid. Then they had kind of a cycle of teachers unsupported. Not only did they not know child development well, but they didn't know academics either. So we need to be very careful in these moments. Yes, kids need a broader set of supports, but they need people who will teach them too. And to kind of let down the goals because the kids are poor or need supports is something we need to guard very, very strongly against.
I totally agree with that. In the first, I think it was maybe second or third year of turning schools around in my work, we were able to turn them around, and people were enjoying being in that environment. It was a good environment. but they forgot to teach. And that's possible when you begin to focus on creating a good culture. So you have to create a good culture that promotes development, that then makes academic learning possible, and you have to focus on academic learning and preparation for life. Because you can raise the test scores, and those same children will then go to community colleges or other activities and not function well. And that's not enough. You have to have academic skills, talents. You also have to be able to function well as a human being. And that's what we need to do in schools. And we need to work out programs and policies that make both academic learning and overall good development possible.
So talk a little bit about how policymakers can look at that. I mean, Governor Sandoval talked a couple of times in the governor's panel yesterday about the victory schools that they just passed legislation for in Nevada and they've funded. And there's a significant amount of investment, but it's really providing those wraparound services in the 20 poorest zip codes in Nevada. And so from a policy side, I mean, that's a good step, but you're talking about the leadership aspect of building that culture, that it's a whole different story for those Nevada legislators or even the governor to figure out how to piece that together.
Go ahead.
Well, I think that on the ground, you need to have mechanisms that allow you to pull all the parties together and policies together so that they work in a synchronized way. One of the greatest problems that I've seen is that you can provide all kinds of wraparounds and help and not make things any better. One example, there was a program in one of our schools and went in and where there were 3 mandates, one from the state, one from the federal, and one from the local for working in a collaborative kind of way for governance and management. All 3 required teams that were going to clash with each other. And so unless you create something on the ground and you pay attention to coordination and management of all the resources that you're bringing in, you're going to have problems. And you can wear people out in the frustration and difficulty of trying to make things work on the ground.
It also, though, seems to me that how states think about their sort of accountability and public reporting systems are also critical here. So as states over the next couple of years sort of take up this new opportunity to try to figure what's the sort of bucket of measures that we want to be focused on as a state, in addition to the academic measures, which are terribly important, and preparation for college and careers, as we can sort of broaden out that bucket, I think thinking about what are the other ways in which we can get valuable information about progress on the other sort of pieces of building sort of trust and focused and cohesion in a school. So something like the state of Illinois administers the Chicago Consortium's 5E survey, which is parents, teachers, kids, to get sort of a broader set of measures on that we know now lead later to academic improvement, but we don't, in most states, bother to collect those measures. So thinking about how to broaden that set of measures as we think about new opportunities and accountability and transparency seem terribly important.
I might add that having time on the ground to do that and making it possible for the educators to collaborate with other people and having enough time to do that, that's a very big problem because they're so busy trying to keep up with the many things they have to do that there's no time built in, and that's what needs to be built, and legislation needs to support the time. But also the preparation so that they know how to do it and can do it consistently.
Mm-hmm. When you're thinking about how to make sure that you have constant information flowing from students themselves too, this is especially true at the high school and middle school level, but even elementary school students can tell us a lot about what's going on in classrooms and are quite willing to do that when we ask them. So thinking about how to tap through student surveys, how our students are experiencing what we do for them will be a hugely important addition to our metrics for looking at school quality.
Katie, how does leadership play into that in some of the schools? I mean, we talk often about what we need to do for the practitioner and the teacher and trying to provide them with the time and the resources, but I mean, there's a lot of states that have done some initiatives recently on kind of principal leadership and getting some leadership qualities that they can train people on to try to help make a difference in the schools.
There's really, in the end, we got the order of things backwards, I think. The focus initially on teacher effectiveness, and then, by the way, maybe leader effectiveness, when anybody who spends time, especially as much time as we do, in unusually high-performing, high-poverty schools, which is what we need more of, understands unequivocally how critical the leader is in building momentum for change. So I do worry that even with the kind of steps that a few states have taken, this is probably the most underinvested in strategy so far. When I look, for example, at what the UK did a few years ago in entirely remaking its school leader programs, they call them head teachers, but in looking to the very best in the profession to redesign that and set it to ed schools, my own view, at least, is that the preparation of future school leaders is way too important to leave to higher education, period. And so any of us who are doing that in our state are just plain crazy. So looking instead to the fabulous school leaders that exist in every state but are rarely asked, could you help us redesign a preparation program? That's the bet I would make if I had millions to put behind it, that's for sure.
I agree with that in part. I think that that there are schools of education capable of working differently, and we've got to find a way to connect them with districts and with local communities in ways that enable them to do that job. That's what we've tried to do and trying to do in New Haven with the Southern Connecticut State University, working with the district, working with our program, working with the city. And that combination of partners who have been in silos in the past, hopefully we can bring them together and bring the knowledge of the changes that we need to change, the things we need to change, and to do that, and to have the power to do that with the executives from various institutions there. But it is a job, it's a task, because we work in traditional ways that are hard to change. And so that legislation and policies that will enable us to work together more easily are needed. And we need to think about how, because we really need the people on the ground who can walk into schools on a daily basis or whenever they choose and see what the needs are, and the needs that the parents express, the needs of children, the needs of all of the parties in the education enterprise. The policymakers need to be able to see them immediately and to work out ways to facilitate those interactions.
So one of our first panels on the first day of the conference, we heard from Chancellor Zimpher of State Universities of New York, and she talked about that, the notion of how it's a big culture change for her with some of the programs that they have in their teaching college. I mean, instead of accepting the notion that they're getting students coming to college who are underprepared, they've had to have a culture change to agree that, okay, we're not preparing the teachers to actually prepare these students to come to our college. And that's a big change that I think happens because of leadership, not necessarily because of policies. And it's a question of, will there be enough ideas like that that are implemented in leaders who are willing to take on that kind of a task? Yeah. Jim, you talk a little bit in a lot of your research about kind of inappropriate adult behaviors, if you will. And I don't want to take that too far, but the notion of, parents and even school staff and officials with titles within a school district, and maybe the messages that they send are not those that are really the best for the development of the child.
for the development of the child, and even for the performance of the staff. Let me give you about 3 examples of. We had a school in the Midwest, working with Ed Ziegler and our program, moved that school from the bottom. They were able to move themselves from the bottom to the top. The superintendent called the principal in and said, "You know your children can't do that well," and accused them of cheating. That problem was his belief that these poor black kids could not succeed at that level. Not only is inappropriate, it's immoral, irresponsible, but it blocks progress. And that was a result, really, of not understanding that it was a developmental issue, and that is what we addressed. They took the test over. They had to take the test over. They did better the second time than they did the first. And so that's a serious kind of problem in the belief system. And I want to add to that is that it reflects a cultural narrative that we have that says poor black kids can't achieve. That has to be undermined, and we have to intentionally and systematically undermine that notion, and that will come in time. But we've got to make a breakthrough. I've made the argument and pointed out that I've been in this business for 50 years, and we've been at school reform for 50 years. We could no longer wait to bring about the kinds of changes in mindset that we now have. And so that's one obstacle. The other problem is that we had one school where there's a 40-point gap in achievement between the black students and the white students. And over a 5-year period, erased that gap completely. The response was that over the next 5 years, they allowed teachers and administrators to come through without training in support for development. And 5 years later, the gap is beginning to return. And so the adult, and what I mean by inappropriate behavior, is a belief system and behaviors that simply do not address the nature of the problem. And there's an lack of understanding about the kind of training that is needed. There's a lack of recognition that the way we run schools and the mindset of teachers and administrators is that kids, some kids, poor kids especially, are bad or dumb and not so smart. And you get what you expect from them. That is inappropriate behavior. And that has to be changed. And they have to come to understand it's what they do on a daily basis that makes a difference. That's why I push the centrality of child development. If you understand that the children are not bad or dumb, and you understand that they're underdeveloped or differently developed, and that they haven't had the kinds of environmental experiences, and that you can provide them those experiences in school, you will begin to see teachers and administrators who once thought they were bad and dumb be amazed, but not only amazed, they're delighted to be able to help the children once they have the skills and capacities to do so. And so policymakers have to develop policies that will give them the skills and capacities to make that happen.
If I could just broaden that point a little bit, Jim just talked about individual educators who are comfortable with a system that tolerates a 40-point gap between black and white students, for example, or between Latino and white students. The reality is that some of our states have adopted accountability systems that make that okay at scale? So one of the questions that I hope you will ask of your own school accountability systems is a simple one, and that is, are we giving A's or 5 stars or whatever our top rating in our school accountability system is to schools that sort of look good overall, but when you look underneath the average, where the black students or the Latino students or whatever are 40 points behind, and that gap is growing. There are quite a number of states, I believe actually a majority of states now continue to give A's to schools that have very large gaps in achievement that are not closing, that in fact are widening. And so we ask somehow, where do those individual beliefs come from? From a whole system that is organized around that idea. And if we change anything in the next iteration of accountability system, it's got not just to be about broadening indicators of success, so we take the crazy pressure off just the test, but it has got also to be about re-examining that fundamental idea, because so long as schools are told over and over again, you're an A school, you're a 5-star school, you're the top, even though underneath there are ugly gaps that are not even making any progress on, then we are going to continue to have this problem. It is a state-sanctioned problem.
We're going to take questions from the audience here soon, so if you have a question, please raise your hand so one of the mic runners can get to you quickly. Katie, I want to ask you a little bit, and Jim, you talked about this, just the notion of how you talk about resources that need to be there to help teachers in schools.
Yeah.
Well, what about parents? I mean, as you're trying to help your child move from early learning into the K-12 system and beyond into post-secondary, what are the resources or policies that legislatures, governors, others could look at to help parents in that capacity?
Ooh, you know, when you visit unusually successful schools in poor neighborhoods, you literally never find them not having made parents a real partner in their efforts. Their relationships with parents don't look exactly like they look in the suburbs. It's not largely about bake sales and always helping in the classroom, but it is a relationship that's sort of partnering around the children's learning. They are drawing on resources wherever they can find them. The PTA, for example, has really nice resources about Common Core if you're in a Common Core state, so schools are drawing on those because they're very helpful. The National Council de la Raza has wonderful materials in Spanish that help parents to understand, again, sort of the academic part of schooling, but they're often reaching out through churches or through community-based organizations, but mostly these are one-off, right? This is an energetic principal, counselor, a couple of teachers. We don't have systematic structures to do that, and that's a problem because parents can play an enormously positive role in the education of their children, even when their own educational levels are low, if we just ask them to and provide them with some guidance about how best to do that. We've not found communities yet where that is not overwhelmingly the sentiment. Sometimes they have more barriers in being able to make it to a meeting or make it to school, but it's not out of lack of love for their children.
I agree very much with that. And I was in the session on poverty with Pedro and Renee and Shauna, and the importance of partnerships was emphasized there. But the point Katie is making about making it systemic and something that can be supported and continued and not a one-off is very, very important. It is that's one part of it, but there's the yo-yo effect of supports also that come. You know, you have supports for a few years, then they're gone. And we have to work out a way that that's not the case, and where programs that are achieving or can demonstrate that what they're doing makes sense need to be supported on an ongoing basis. On the point of partnerships, we're involved with, and I saw Dr. Knight here from Hartsville, South Carolina. there, a district recognized that it was important to have partnerships between the government and the district and private industry, and did so in a small southern town area. And I think the importance is very necessary that we do that across the country. We begin to look at how we bring industry and private sector into the work with schools and the work with districts so that we can get the impact and power of everybody. Right. And where people can begin as a community to understand. After all, you know, what we're really dealing with is the loss of community. And we're dealing with the income inequality that has developed over the years. And we've got to find another way to restore what parents able to work were able to provide, and the kind of quality relationships that they were able to provide without ever going to a school. You know, parents in a community that was warm and caring and supportive met their teachers and administrators in the grocery store and a variety of other places that created natural communities and natural relationships in ways that we can't do today, which means we have to intentionally recreate those communities.
Are there any questions from the audience for our esteemed panelist here? Got one in the back.
Kim Sadel, 2015 Idaho Teacher of the Year. I work with at-risk students in high school, and we've come to the conclusion we need to start calling them at promise, because at-risk is a negative connotation. And you mentioned the change in thought process, expectations of adults. My question is how do you change children or teenagers who for 13 years have been told that they're not good enough, that they're never going to succeed? And that's the problem we're having, is how do you motivate these kids to change their thought process?
Well, I think you do it first, you begin to do it in school, but then those kids are part of social networks outside of school, where you can also encourage people to begin to understand the need for the positive approach and constructive beliefs, and organize them and engage them and involve them in networks where the message is different. And right now, the other thing we're trying to do in New Haven is to engage the NAACP in programs for kids and programs that will help them develop the positive sense of self and hope for the future. And after-school programs, we have 2 African-American philanthropists who started a program, after-school program, and the sororities and fraternities are involved in supporting it, where a different message will be sent to the kids about their possibilities. You know, that cultural narrative from the society sinks in, and the kids believe that they have no future. The way you counter it is to take a subcultural narrative that transmit a different kind of message. And that once existed in a natural way. The Black church did that for many Black people and Black students. As society began to impact church in a way that it was no longer as powerful as it once was, the message disappeared or was weakened. And so we have to restore ways to transmit that message. You know, it was once said, and this was a hyperbole and created a problem, but it was, once you'd ask any African American, they'd say, you have to be twice as good to be successful, to get half as far. That's an unfortunate message, but it's a reality that kids have to address. The bottom line was that you don't let race or anything else stop you. You achieve in spite of it and go around over the obstacles to be successful. Somewhere that message has to be transmitted. If you can't do it in school, you can do it in school, but you also reach into the community to begin to promote that message again.
So questions like that are a heartbreaking reminder of something we don't like to acknowledge, and that is, yeah, it's quite possible that those kids you're talking about were told by parents or relatives or somebody else that they weren't worth much. But the reality is they were probably told that in school too. And one of the questions for all of us is why we tolerate that. There is pretty extensive malpractice going on in many schools, especially schools that serve large numbers of low-income kids. And we know from successful schools that serve those same children, we know the power of what these schools often call the huddle, which is the power not of a single heroic adult, but of a team of adults at the school to literally surround a kid and pull them up. But those schools also know the power of even individual adults to tear kids down. So what's different about those schools is they don't tolerate individual adults doing that. They say they're not good enough for our kids. And so one of the questions for people like you in your high school is, how can we change the culture in our profession that says, you know, I'm going to close the door in my classroom and not worry about other people in the school or other issues in the school? How can we send signals from our high schools that are receiving in kids who've been told by their elementary teachers or their middle school teachers that they're not good enough? How can we as a profession take ownership around that's not okay? Because it's not. Even a single adult can tear a child down in ways that are not impossible, but almost impossible for others. So acting on that as a profession feels important.
All right, got another question in the back there, and then we have one up front.
Just a quick question for Katie. Thanks for the good news on the K-12 side, but we know that if we don't get these people to college and get them a college credential, we failed them in a more dramatic way than ever before. They will be probably working poor. We know all the data. 2/3 of all the new and replacement jobs will require a college credential. College credentials are worth more today than ever. So I know you and Ed Trust, and we've talked a lot about K-12 in our meetings here, but I know you and Ed Trust have shown the spotlight on higher ed as well. So that was good news in the K-12 sector, but I'd love to hear a few of your comments on what you're seeing on the college side, 2-year and 4-year in terms. I know, I'll just say in Illinois, I'll own up, over the last 5 years, our gaps in education attainment for people of color have grown dramatically, even though we've raised the overall education level. So we've been getting more educated and leaving these folks behind. So that's my state. I'd just be interested in your national perspective on that.
Yeah. Don't get me started, Jim. You know, this is right. So we got a lot of work to do on the higher ed side, friends. I mean, there is good news too there. There are colleges and universities around the country that have stepped up to kind of own the issues around low-income students and students of color, and where their efforts over time have brought about enormous growth. So we see places like Georgia State University, Florida State University, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, that serve significant numbers of African American students, most of whom are low income, but who graduate at least the same rate as their white counterparts. So we know from higher education that when institutions really focus on student success and when they really tackle the issues that get in the way, we can change these numbers. So again, plenty of evidence from individual institutions that are teaching us that these patterns that we've seen for years don't have to exist. However, if you ask, is there big movement at scale? Answer, no, not so much. At best, this tends to be a kind of minor message. So we put a little performance money on the stake for higher ed institutions. Student success for low-income students or students of color is one of 47 measures in that bucket. Kind of a weak signal, and it gets kind of weak attention. With higher ed, the signals need to be very strong to get their attention. Y'all know that by now. So I think one of the questions for you is how to incent institutions of higher ed to take these students much more seriously, because you're right, Jim, what we all know is that in this economy, no post-secondary credential means you're pretty stuck. So we've got to approach this with an urgency that doesn't make this optional for institutions, that makes it a part of their fundamental responsibility. And that's what we're a little slow to do.
Got time for one more question from the audience.
The elephant in the room is that poverty is directly related to intact families with two people in the home. And given that so many of the children that we talked about, especially in the last session, and that Pedro was referencing in his presentation, are never going to have that. It's just, and there's nothing we can do about that. There's nothing the government can do about that, the community, the churches. It's beyond our control. I'm going to throw a bomb and ask you what you think about a boarding school program that is year-long, pretty much that could start with foster children, which are already in the worst situations. I mean, they are in, it's unbelievable what's going on in the foster system in this country, where we would have complete control over what is done to these children and for these children, with nanny cameras if we have to avoid, the Dickensian possibilities of horrible things, and actually get a hold of these kids and make them into human beings that are going to be in control of their lives.
Do you want to take that first?
I think examples from the Native American experience and other experiences tell us that you really don't want to pull kids away from their families and communities. And at the same time, the message needs to be infused and the conditions need to be infused. There's always, when the problems are hugely complex, there's always a temptation to go after something you can put your hand on that is rather simple, that looks like it's going to solve it, but in fact it can make matters worse, because we're going to have to work through the complexity, and we're going to have to start at both ends, from policies, from top policymakers and all the policymakers that change the cultural narrative, that changes the attitudes and values, belief systems, and begins to make those communities different, and changes the justification for the income disparity. The justification, as I mentioned, is that they don't work hard, they don't care, and that's why they have low-level jobs. That notion has to be changed, and we're going to have to do something about income inequality. That's the one side, what the society has to do. On the other side, family, teachers, leaders in the community have to and can be effective with individual children and with groups of children. That has to start. I still recall, because I'm from a low-income family, and all around me were conditions and so on that would be troublesome. But I still remember my mother saying to me that, "You're a Comer. You can't do that." Now, what is a Comer? It was a belief system, a way of thinking, a way of performing that was expected in our family, in our community, and in the church network that I was a part of, that has to become a part of the subculture of families that are outside the mainstream, that has to become a part of the school. You have to believe in the kids, and you have to provide them with experiences that will give them the capacities to be successful. And so it's both ends. It is the individual, the family, the primary social network, and it is the larger society, the tertiary network, that all have to send the same message, because we're all going to pay the same price if we don't address these problems. The family to prison pipeline has to be interrupted, or we all pay a price. The dependency pipeline, all of those negative things that we see in the society have to be disrupted. Or we're going to become a less competitive society, we're going to become a less good society, and that's not going to take 100 years to happen. That's going to take another generation to happen. And we've got to move now, because I say I've been at it for 50 years. We've made progress, but we have not made nearly enough progress given all of the threats that face our country at this present time.
So I'm glad Jim responded to your question immediately, because I was struggling to respond to your question, in part because every time people suggest what you suggested, I take it a little personally. I struggled for 15 years to raise kids with an alcoholic husband, and finally said, you know what, it'd be better for my kids if I raised them alone. So when I hear people make assertions about moms or dads who raise children alone, I find it rather challenging not to get upset. But one of the things that I think that's a dodge for, and obviously we know the relationship between one income and two and poverty, is the United States of America has the next to the highest poverty rate in the entire, child poverty rate in the entire developed world. We allow more of our children to live in poverty than any other developed country except Romania. Not because we have the highest rate of single parenting, we actually don't, and not for the other reason that people assert, that is, we have more people not working. We actually don't have that either, but because it's a choice we've made as a country to just allow far more of our families to live in awful circumstances with few supports. That's been a choice we've made. But in education, how we respond to children in poverty is also a choice. And we can either choose to give in to the kind of conventional wisdom, which is if children are poor, there's pretty much nothing we can do. Until we fix poverty, we'll never fix the achievement gap. Or we can do what more and more educators around the country are successfully doing, and that is push back, right? And create schools where all kids can thrive and are thriving. Now, should boarding schools be some of that? Sure. I mean, I think often about an experience when Tom Bradley was mayor of Los Angeles many years ago. He said, some of our kids live in such desperate circumstances, we should create boarding schools for them. And he immediately got just hammered by pretty much every sort of official, sort of organizational, civil rights type leader in the Los Angeles basin. But one of the local news cameras took a camera on the shoulder and went out on the streets in some of the poorest neighborhoods in Los Angeles and asked parents, many of whom had children in hand. And with tears in their eyes, many of them said, I would miss my children terribly, but raising children in these circumstances is so hard, it's so challenging, that yes, I'd gladly sign them up in a minute. So should that be a part of our arsenal for kids who live in horrible circumstances? Absolutely. But that is not what we need to do for most of our kids. Regular public schools have taught us that we can teach them the high levels too, and we should.
And there are some successful boarding schools right now. Yeah, right.
Katie and Jim, thank you both for sharing your insights with us. I know you're going to be around for a little bit, but as former James Bryant Conan Award winners, it is truly an honor to have both of you here with your insights and perspectives to share with our national forum as we celebrate our 50th anniversary. Please join me in thanking Katie and Jim.